To understand Pope Francis and John Henry Newman is to appreciate the word freedom. Freedom, human and divine freedom. I am quite aware today that to associate Pope Francis with St. John Henry Newman, a thing I have no hesitations doing, requires a feat of courage. To try to prove that Francis's sense of moral conscience is like Newman's is to push courage still further. The clouds of controversy associated with the name Pope Francis are quite alive. Yet, my abiding and elaborate scholarly investigation into the mind of Pope Francis, the contemporary church, and the Second Vatican Council propels me to say without fear of contradiction that there is so much in common between the two church personalities, Pope Francis and St. John Henry Newman. Moral conscience is one of those areas where the two have very similar ideas, especially as regards Christ's lay faithful. What Pope Francis has done to the laity in marriage life and family, especially in the 8th chapter of his apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, John Henry Newman did in his own consultation with the laity in matters of doctrine. In those two masterpieces, the authors underscored the primacy of conscience. They were unapologetic about it and stirred a hornet's nest. Though the themes of his theological discourses never delved so profoundly into the subject of matrimony and family, Newman instructed himself on and practiced the delightful values of the family in the way he lived his life. He came from a Christian family of 6, and though at one time bankrupt, it was a happy Christian family. Pope Francis is at home with the subject of matrimony and family. He optimally demonstrates this in his inspiring apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. The manner of diagnosing the problems people encounter in families and their solutions to the church needs revamping. Pope Francis reiterates in this apostolic exhortation that we have long thought that simply by stressing doctrinal, bioethical, and moral issues without encouraging openness to grace, we were providing sufficient support to families, strengthening the marriage bond, and giving meaning to marital life. Francis points out that the method of investigating marital moral issues must change. His posture on conscience in Amoris Laetitia, therefore, is one of the most fundamental teachings in the exhortation. We also find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations. We have been called to form consciences, Pope Francis continues, and not to replace them. One of the remarkable things Catholic fundamentalists or ecclesiastical ideologues ignore, but which Pope Francis and John Henry Newman know, is that Christ's lay faithful are just like everybody else in the Catholic Church. They, through their baptism, like clerics and religious, are priests, kings, and prophets. The power the family wields in the context of contemporary Catholic ethics and morality is outstanding. It carries a celebrated relevance in a contemporary ethics and morality. Evidently, the church as family is the very model of faith today. Mutual freedom is a family component that is as paramount as it is essential. Family relationships form the conscience in boosting frank discourse, sincere dialogue, and openness to the truth of the other person. This boils down to the importance of the social element in human moral action. Consequent on this, it is important that we look deeply at this quintessential quality that is common to the theology of Newman and Francis, the primacy of freedom. To understand Pope Francis and John Henry Newman is to appreciate the word freedom. Freedom, human and divine freedom. John Henry Newman, the arch enemy of liberalism, was also the arch defender of human and divine freedom. Theologically, the concept of moral conscience is rooted in the event of creation, in the book of Genesis, in the rapport between God and man. From that very beginning, the Creator had willed it that freedom would define his relationship with man. Friendship and love become the force animating this affinity. The primum ethicum God appeals to is not obedience to a norm or law, but is freedom that becomes the standard against which man's closeness with God will be measured. If a man desires to obey God, he must be free to do so. Of course, freedom here is that defined by the biblical vision, the original notion of freedom, which still acknowledges man's dependence unto God. It is a freedom which underlines dialogue as a conditio sine qua non for making moral decisions. When Pope Francis makes one of his first appearances as Pope with the famous phrase, "Who am I to judge someone?" It is a phrase packed with profound meaning and the deepest convictions of a pontiff whose rootedness in God's creative and aboriginal freedom is incontestable. The creative freedom of God is therefore constituted in the creature's DNA. Fellow friends, it is also significant to see Newman in the light of the mercy theme that Pope Francis has preached from mountaintops, and which is the defining quality of his pontificate. Mercy, the metaphor of Newman's life. Life is a great teacher. Many people who study Newman speak about conscience, truth, philosophy, preaching, but fail to realize the central place of mercy, God's boundless compassion in the life of the saints. Like Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, Newman's search for the truth threw him from his high intellectual horse into a spiritual turmoil in the hands of the merciful Mother Church. From the high horse of rabbinical scholarship, Paul would bow down before Ananias, and from the high horse of Oxford scholarship, Newman would bow down before Father Dominic Barbery. Their conversion stories demonstrate a certain interconnection between the search for truth and the power of compassion in human life. In fact, in a speech that began the Second Vatican Council, Pope John XXIII spelled out that the power of mercy is to be the defining principle in Vatican II, saying, "Today, Christ's bride, the Church, prefers the balm of mercy to the arm of severity. She believes that present needs are best served by explaining more fully the purport of her doctrines rather than by publishing condemnations." The effects of these words were far-reaching, not only to the Ecumenical Council Fathers, but its message on the balm of mercy has been all-embracing in the Church after the Council. So remarkable and extensive have been the benefits of the message that since the days of Pope John XXIII to our own, the Church has found mercy as an original way of bringing a new breath of fresh air back in the world. The mercy of God, Pope Francis says, is the beating heart of the gospel. To be able to fathom, therefore, the profundity of God's mercy shown Newman in his conversion story, it is important to understand the amount of hate speech John Henry Newman spewed on Catholicism during his Anglican days. He grew up believing that the Roman Catholic Church was a symbol of the Antichrist foretold in the Bible. His abhorrence as an Anglican of the Catholic Church was razor sharp. A man who hurled curses and invective at the Catholic Church like crafty, obstinate, malicious, cruel, unnatural, demoniac, could not but be grateful to this very church for inestimable mercy shown an arch-enemy like him. Come to think of it, in 1844, just some months before his conversion to Rome, Newman was still at daggers with the Roman Catholic Church, and he said, "I have no existing sympathies with Roman Catholics. I hardly ever, even abroad, was at one of their services. I know none of them. I do not like what I hear of them." The mercies of God began visiting Newman's soul. This period, immediately before his conversion, he called his Anglican deathbed. A deathbed has scarcely a history. It is tedious decline, with seasons rallying and seasons of falling back. This deathbed symbolizes the vision of God's mercy in Newman's life. On the 9th of October, 1845, Newman was received into the Catholic Church. You will see his conversion into Catholicism as a manifestation of God's mercy in his life. This is the profound impact of mercy on those who honestly search for the truth. I will now direct our attention to the theological values common to Pope Francis and St. John Henry Newman. At a time when Catholic Christian theology is in peril of falling victim to the ever-present dangers of clericalism, cold legalism, and reductionism in this generation of faithlessness, Pope Francis and Cardinal Newman's example of bravery and commitment under great pressure is well worth pondering. To begin with, in Francis and Newman, faith does not contradict reason. They too believe instead that when we are certain about what we believe in, that certainty is not so much a conclusion, like solving a mathematical equation, as an act of childlike humility, of a trusting child to his parent. Tradition is never complete. Tradition, according to Newman, grows and matures with time, with the abiding direction of the Holy Spirit. To some church thinkers, precisely of the modern traditionalism school of thought, church tradition of the family and matrimony stopped in 1981 with Pope John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio. As centuries pass by, the world moves and changes. Likewise, the church. New complexities and challenges present themselves to the church, which has to give answers and relevant answers. The Holy Spirit would always have something to teach the church in her theologians, philosophers, and scientists. Another amazing thing about Pope Francis and Cardinal Newman is the highlight each of them make on the subjective man, his personal history, and the concrete reality he lives. To this question, we must go back to the Second Vatican Council and its refreshing principles. And the Ecumenical Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty is the quintessence of this principle. In that document, the Church changed the ground on human identity and saw man, and is still seeing man truly in the image and likeness of God, to be prized and permitted to use his conscience. Furthermore, despite the varied purposes that inspired their calling and the different times they lived, Pope Francis, St. Vincent of Lerins, and St. John Henry Newman share the idea that Christian doctrine develops and that faith and morals can grow and reshape themselves while still remaining docile to their traditional origins. I must now also touch, however briefly, on the centrality of moral conscience in the theologies of these two church thinkers. To them, a human being at any price must follow his conscience. Conscience is that aboriginal vicar of Christ that impels our daily actions. Because we are flawed by original sin, Pope Francis and St. Newman are of the conviction that formation of conscience is a sine qua non. Also, in Francis and Newman, we understand that the process and accomplishment of the search for moral truth is larger than intelligence, logic, and calculation. It has always been essential to move in small doses, perceptibly and unhurriedly with the person in the lived experience of the moral truth or moral value in question. This is where the law of gradualness comes in, and which Pope Francis makes the following helpful precision, that this is not a gradualness of law, but rather a gradualness in the prudential exercise of free acts on the part of subjects who are not in a position to understand, appreciate, or fully carry out the objective demands of the law. It can be followed with the help of grace. Dear friends, if you are a theologian of today, John Henry Newman and Pope Francis are names you cannot avoid. The human-focused, Christocentric, mercy-planting faith propagated and propagation we witness today simply would not possess its majestic brilliance without the names Newman and Bergoglio. In his theology, Pope Francis fashions compassion, conviction, and competence, virtues that help render faith values more accessible to the human heart. Quite embarrassingly, when Amoris Laetitia was published, the reception was interrupted by an unfair reaction, and I underline unfair because it is my conviction that the criticism was exaggerated. To me, two things were clear about the opposition. First, a misunderstanding of what tradition in the Catholic Church is. Second, a reckless opposition to the magisterium of Pope Francis. What we have witnessed in the course of Pope Francis's pontificate, in terms of hostility to his person, defies human intelligence, a thing that sometimes tempts one to opine that it seems the Catholic Church least expected to be governed by a man from the peripheries of the world. The prolific North American theologian Maximo Fagioli said some time ago that opposition to Pope Francis is rooted in the rejection of Vatican II. To this statement, one is persuaded to respond in the affirmative.